My name is Tamar Russell Brown, and I'm from Gallery Sitka, which is in Shirley, Massachusetts at the moment. We have a harvest show, which was a juried art show that was produced just beginning of August. We had 3 jurors, and they picked a number of women from all over New England, but primarily Central Mass. This is an art show that's primarily women's Caucus for Art group, and this is the North Central Mass chapter. And one of the women that's part of this show is Helen Obermeyer Simmons, who is with us tonight. So we're going to do an interview. We're going to look at her work. We're going to talk a little bit about her history and her life. And also the website you can look at is gallerysitka.com. There's a tab that says Harvest, and that's where you can see all the work. You can see the jurors, you can see pictures of the artists. So we invite you to go there and have a look at the work, and certainly shop if you need something for your home. So this evening, Helen, thanks for joining us.
Sure, I'm back in Lunenburg, Massachusetts now. I've been spending quite a bit of my summertime in Connecticut, but it feels nice to be home.
Well, welcome. We're happy you could join us this evening. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, Helen, could you tell us where you're from and where you went to school?
Well, I'm from a number of places because my father was in the Navy. He was a captain in the Navy. And so I spent time in the Boston area and the Washington, D.C. area. And the longest station was in Yokosuka, Japan. And so I went to American school, but I took Japanese dancing and hula dancing and Japanese culture and language. And we took people around a lot on tours because we were there for 4 years. So a lot of people came to visit. And for example, Yokosuka is not too far from the big Buddha at Kamakura, which is a huge thing. And I went down, I remember going to see the deer at Nara. And I also, not with my parents, but with a friend of mine, they invited me to climb Mount Fuji, which I did. We weren't there for the sunrise, but we got to the top of Mount Fuji. So.
Excellent. I actually didn't know that you lived in Japan. Which part did you live in?
Yokosuka, which is about, I would say maybe an hour outside of Tokyo, south of Tokyo. Yeah.
What age were you in?
I was 8 to 12. And one of the things that I do remember is when I was there, President Kennedy was assassinated. And I remember just walking in the streets and all the people coming up to say how sorry they were that our president had died. And I think that was like one of those major events that I can remember from my childhood.
That's really interesting. I bet for that age, what a big impression that must have made on you.
Yes. And the other thing, I was on a show where it was like, guess what is it called, guess my line or something like that. And a young woman who actually could speak Japanese was one of the Japanese dancers. And then we got on and did our little Japanese dancing thing. And forever after that, people would come up to me and say, "Oh, so." But it was really a wonderful place to grow up. Our house was a renovated Japanese home. And it had some Western things, but it had a Japanese garden around it. And my mother took Japanese flower arranging and Japanese sumiya painting. So I really, was immersed in that culture.
That's really cool, Helen. I didn't know that.
Hmm.
So where else did you live?
Okay, so then after that, my father got a job in New York at Texaco, and he worked in the Chrysler building. And so I would go in to visit him in New York. And I think I was only 14, 15 and stuff, but I started going to all the museums there. And I think that's where I got my first taste of looking at real art. Later on, I went to Stevens College, which is in Columbia, Missouri, in the middle of Missouri, which was it was a culture shock but from where I had been before. But there were girls from all over the Midwest. And we were in the same town with the University of Missouri at Columbia, which is the Mizzou Tigers. So there was certainly plenty of social life there. And that's where I began to take up art. And I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted either art or dance. But when I got to Stevens, I realized art was really my true love and passion. And so that's when I decided to major in that. And it wasn't until my sophomore year that I decided to take up photography. And for the first class that I took, I used a Diana camera, which is a little $1 camera. I did my whole photo one with a Diana camera. And then my father took me into New York and bought me my first 35mm camera. So.
Excellent.
Because he saw I was serious.
I said, I see on your resume that you were also in Rochester.
I was. Now, Rochester is, I spent a year back in Connecticut after I graduated from Stevens, and then I went up to RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, which is a wonderful photography town. And I was in graduate school, so there was only 15 in my class and 15 in the class ahead of me. And so it was a really intimate time to just take and make a lot of different photographs. But I was still interested in art. And so I went, there's like a bridge. I went across the bridge to the art department and I began to study printmaking there. And so I did quite a bit of etching, but then I turned into doing photo etching, which is what my thesis project was all about. And I also, in conjunction with that, I did a lot of research in my family history. So my mother and I went up to Nova Scotia, which is where her family had been from, the Grants. And we looked around and we found an old, fellow who sort of knew the history. And we actually hooked up with a man named John McLean, who was a distant relative, who had a dairy farm there. And so you asked about the harvest earlier. I think that one of the sort of an unusual thing, I think, is when I was out in North Dakota, they began to do the haying. And the other thing that was extraordinary about the landscape there were the sunflower fields. Acres and acres of sunflowers in bloom with that really beautiful yellow color. And the people we were staying with had to do all the haying for these horses that they had to feed through the winter. And so we were able to go and film some of that too. So.
That's really, really cool. I didn't know about your Nova Scotian roots. That's really cool.
Well, and in fact, there's a ship called the Hector, which is the earliest ship to come from Scotland to Nova Scotia, which is also New Scotland. And some of my ancestors were on that ship, the Hector.
Really?
The Frasers, yeah.
So you're a Scot?
Yes, ma'am. Stand fast is my grant motto.
Ah, very cool, very cool, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back a little bit to your education. So
Sure.
You saw work in New York when you were young.
Right.
Going in to visit your father. When did you decide that you wanted to get into art for work?
Well, I think that I was always interested in graphics and graphic design. I did a lot of logo design and things when I was in high school. And one of the things that I did do was, for my senior project in high school, was I took my grandmother's rocking chair and stripped it down entirely and hand painted it with acrylic paints. And so I've done chairs since then, but that was my first chair. And I think the thing about it, it was really special because it had been my grandmother's chair. She was the only senior relative, I guess, that I knew, and she lived with us for a couple of years in Connecticut.
So when did you come to our area into this?
That would have been in around 1980. My friend in graduate school was really on the ball, and he applied for teaching jobs all over, and he got an interview here at Fitchburg, and he called me and he said, Helen, they asked me if I have a friend who could teach graphic design. And so I said, well, okay, Joe, let's go. I went to the RIT bookstore and I got all the best books, and I studied up and I put together a portfolio. And so then we came, and for goodness sakes, they offered both of us the jobs. And so I told them, I said, well, now look, I can come, but I can't come for a couple of weeks. And so the chair of the department, who was a man named Lee DeNike, he held my classes, and he kept saying, and she's coming soon, she's coming soon. And pretty soon I was just thrown into teaching, trial by fire, truly.
Wow, that's amazing. So how did you find teaching here in Fitchburg? How did you find it?
Oh, I loved it. I think the students at Fitchburg are really down to earth. A lot of them were working their way through school. I think they were really excited when the computer came in and they could do work on the computer. And so I always found that when I was teaching classes, that the students were happy to be in my classes. The other thing was that I think my strong suit is also more traditional media, painting and drawing and watercolor and stuff. So I would integrate that into my classes to get more of the handcrafted feel into things.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question that I didn't prepare, we didn't talk about, but I think it's interesting. I was wondering how you feel your graphic design teaching training has factored into your art making.
Well, I think one of the things that I do is I do a lot of collage work, and that's quite a bit about laying things out. And I've always been one who has to see all the different materials and put them together on the thing. And I'm composing, but I'm kind of just composing by eye and by feeling. And I think that after seeing so much student work, you kind of get a feeling for what you're looking at. And, you know, because you always have to be on top of your game with making suggestions for them of how they can improve their work. The other thing is working with those young people for so long kept me young. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
So Helen, when did you start making your own artwork?
Well, I started making my own artwork in high school, really, but became truly invested in, I would say, when I was an undergraduate at Stevens, spending a lot of time in the studio. And I did do a whole program in graphic design there as well. So, but
how has your work evolved from when you started?
Well, I think one of the things that I try and be and do is to be experimental. And so I'm always sort of looking at the next thing. The other thing I've been doing is reworking a lot of my old prints and pieces like that, and then sort of collaging them in with new meanings. Because after studying the family history for so long, I have new information about the people that I'm putting into the work. So.
And I was wondering, I noticed that a lot of your work has something to do with the past, something to do with the past. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I think I'm always looking for family. My father was an only child, and so he didn't have it. I had no aunts and uncles on that side. My mother had a brother that she wasn't particularly close to. And I think that other idea of having to travel so much and always make your home wherever you are sort of got me to explore the family roots part of things.
That's
but
interesting.
yeah, I think the other thing was my mother was interested in this whole family history. And so I remember her taking me up to the attic and showing me old photographs and old clothes and things like that. And so it was something that we could share together. And my mother was one of my greatest promoters. She was a writer, by the way. So she'd write my press releases and make sure I got my stuff in shows. And she was sort of the Connecticut branch of that operation.
You're a publicist.
Yes, yeah, I did have one. Yeah.
That's excellent. So yeah, that's something I've always noticed about your work, but now I understand why. You have people and history and family. It's really interesting.
I think another thing that's kind of interesting is when I say I taught at Fitchburg State, they all think I taught history because I know an awful lot about Fitchburg history, actually. That's my area of expertise. And there's an architect named H.M. Francis, who I've also studied quite a bit and done shows and talks about H.M. And so I think that that idea of, well, this is something that I encourage with my students, is you have to do research. Whenever you do a project, you have to know what you're designing for. And so all of that research, I did quite a bit of it at the Historical Society and put together some shows there and things like that. So I do know a lot about Fitchburg history.
We should probably do a Zoom just about H.M. Francis.
Oh yeah, he's a great guy. In fact, his architecture has got a historic district all to itself. It's the only one in Massachusetts where it's based on one man's architecture. And I don't know if you ever noticed, but you go around and you look at different buildings in town and they have a plaque on them that say designed by H.M. Francis.
So roughly how many buildings in Fitchburg were done by him?
Well, he did, I think it's probably about 10 churches, and he did the original library, he did the original high school, and then many, many residents, because he was supported by a man named Rodney Wallace, who was the fellow who endowed the library as well. And so, you know, sort of once you got on that fast track, one of the ways you showed your wealth was by having a beautiful home. So most of the beautiful architecture that is in Fitchburg was designed by H.M. Francis, who was a Lunenburg guy originally. So, and he had a brother who was a contractor. And so I think the two of them worked on projects together.
So he was actually from this region. He was.
Yes, he was. Yes.
Which,
Yeah.
you know which home was his home where he lived?
Yes, in fact, I do. And it's across from the FATV, and it's in awful shape. But the building was moved from Lunenburg. It was the old academy in Lunenburg, and moved over to Fitchburg to be H.M. Francis's home. It's on Rollstone Street.
Wow, that's really interesting. Have you ever done an H.M. Francis tour?
Yes, we used to do trolley tours, which was kind of fun. We drive around to these neighborhoods. Another place where there are quite a few H.M. Francis buildings is on a street off of Summer Street called Atlantic Avenue. And so that's sort of where you can, it's my favorite little neighborhood in town where you can just go in and get a sense everyone's kept up the houses really nicely there. And I think because it's off the main road, many of the older places got saved.
Really interesting. It's a beautiful downtown. Actually, there's a lot of, that's why I wanted to bring a gallery here, because it's
yes
downtown.
And he did do quite a few of the commercial buildings too. The Safety Fund Bank is his, and the original, what they call the Annex, or Fitchburg High School, which is sort of a mansard style, is one of his too.
Really?
I think we have someone here who lives in an H.M. Francis building.
We do?
We do.
I didn't know that was too. That was one of his also.
Yes. Yeah.
The school that was built to be a school.
It was built to be a school, and now it's a studio.
Everything changes. Everything changes.
Yeah.
So now I want to talk a little bit about your work that you put into this show that was submitted.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about the piece that got accepted first, and then I can flip the screen?
Sure. Well, I was down in Connecticut, and my sister-in-law actually was quite ill, and I was staying at her little apartment place, which was right on the railroad tracks. And so the trains, which were going into New York and out of New York, were going right through her backyard. So one morning, I think I woke up and I saw this extraordinary light, this orangish light against these sort of trees that have been overgrown with ivy. And so I made that photograph. And I think it's kind of, for me, it's a kind of a mystical photograph. And it goes back to that idea of sort of reminiscing and about the past. I think probably the reason why it fits into the show is because of the nature of the coloring, and that it looks kind of spooky. But I think that's what morning light will give you, is a really beautiful, beautifully lit scene.
Well, let's go ahead and look at it. I'm going to share my screen.
There it is.
There it is.
Yeah, and you can sort of see on the lower part there's the tracks.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a little forgotten part of town that no one would ever see unless they looked out their back window. And the way the ivy was growing up over the tree branches was quite beautiful. And
the light.
Yeah, and the light, that early morning light.
So this is the one that our judges picked, but I want to look at the other ones that you sent.
Sure. Okay, so that first one is really a self-portrait. And it's just done in, I think, pen and watercolor. And I don't know, she has sort of this pensive look on her face. And one of the reasons one of the things I like about it is the simplicity of it and the fact that it's just sort of barely there.
Well, it's very like graphic design, Helen, actually, you know?
I know, yeah, like that illustration that I talked to you about.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, very simple, wonderful colors. And then we have this one here.
Yes, now that one, that's actually Northfield Studio, which is our house. But it's sort of got this stained glass kind of a filter on it. And I can't even remember what season it was. It might have been like in midsummer or whatever. But I really like the way that the colors moved into each other. And sort of there's only one, the house is the only thing that you could sort of make out as something that's reality.
So how did you do this, Helen?
So that's really just taking an image that I had made, a 35 millimeter image, and bringing it in and fooling around with filters with it, I think. So it's quite digital, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you use a combination of a variety of media.
Yes, mixed media. Yeah, that is the thing.
Whatever you like doing. And what about this one?
Okay, now this one, the two figures, one is my husband's grandmother, Rose, and his grandfather, Vito, who both came from Italy. They were both from the same hometown in Italy called Faeto. And what you see sort of on the top by Vito and also in the lower part is that they wrote postcards to each other. And Vito was fixed up with Rose. He was from Bridgeport and she was from Stamford, Connecticut. And I guess the families knew each other. And so down in the bottom, you have sort of their engagement photograph. And the story goes that Rose was the older sister. And so the older sister had to be married off the first in the family. And he always joked with her about it. But he was an interesting man. He ended up being an electrician or electrical engineer on the New Haven Railroad. And so that whole idea of that railroad going right through Darien is sort of part and parcel of that particular place.
And part of so really curious, arranged marriage, was this common at that time?
Well, I don't know that it was an arranged marriage. I think that his family knew her family, let's just put it that way. And he courted her for a while, and then they were married at St. John's in Stamford, Connecticut. But the other thing that's interesting about this piece is I have also these sort of, there are pieces of flowers in there, which are sort of like photograms of the flowers sort of floating around. And there are also a few feathers, I think, that sort of represent time passing or memory, something like that. One of the things that I do quite a bit of with my work is when I coat on my photographic solution, I do it with a brush. And so I get these sort of brushed edges there that are just sort of by chance. And I like that because it adds to the painterly quality of the image.
So just in terms of technique, Helen, how did you put this piece together?
Okay, so I made enlarged negatives that were the same size as what I was going to print. I think this piece is about 23 by 25. And then I also just brought in leaves and petals, and also I had the I'd made enlarged negatives of the postcards also. And I just sort of laid them down. And what you do is you lay the pieces down on top of the sensitized paper, and you put a piece of glass on top, and you take it out in the sunlight, and you let it sit for about 15 minutes, and you watch it. Now, I've been doing this so long, I know when it's right, when it's done. And then you bring it back into the studio, and you wash it out in water. And wherever the light hits, turns brown. And wherever the light doesn't hit, it stays white. And so it reproduces the photographic nature of the piece. Yeah.
What is that technique called?
Okay, so this one's called Van Dyke Brown. And you have two base chemicals called potassium ferrocyanide and ferric ammonium citrate. And then you also mix in some silver nitrate, which is what turns it to brown. Yeah.
Wow.
So this process is a little more expensive than the other process, which is coming up in the next piece.
Okay. And one other question. So do you have to go back in and colorize the image where you want the color?
That's right, exactly, because everything is either brown or white in this case.
Got it. So then you colorize that with watercolor or...
Yeah. And sometimes colored pencil, because you get a good strong color with colored pencil too.
Got it.
Or, yeah.
I love it. It's very interesting, the process. Let's see.
Thank you. Yeah. So, okay, so this is a different one. And this is actually happens to be my sister, and my sister with my father, and my sister with my mother, and my sister when she was just a little tiny thing. And what I've done with this is I've sort of combined those together. And then I have, again, it looks sort of like kind of like a letter. My mother grew up in Arizona. And so this is sort of representational of where she grew up, which was Jerome, Arizona, which is a mining town on top of a mountain. And they were mining copper out of that mountain. And so I think that that's sort of why I've chosen that particular palette for that. And some of the landscapes that I've got in, which are really just stamps. And then I think I've got this little handmade circle that I crafted, and I have a paintbrush and I have a painted feather.
So this process, is it a similar process, Helen?
It's exactly the same. It's the two chemicals that when you mix them separately, they're not light sensitive. When you mix them together, they become light yellow. And then you brush it onto the, I actually use cover stock as the paper that I use. And then I expose it. Although the piece here, actually I've got a couple of color Xerox elements in that one too.
So how is it that you have one has a blue and the other one?
The difference is you add silver nitrate. And when you add silver nitrate, it turns brown in the light. And if you just have the other two chemicals, it just stays blue. Now, and this process is much more cost effective to do.
Is this something that is easy for a person to do? Is it easy for a person to find?
Well, there is a place called Photographer's Formulary that will either send you pre-sensitized paper, or you can buy the base chemistry and mix them up yourself. One of the things I had to do when I was teaching at the college is you had to dispose of all the chemicals through the chemistry people who did that. And so we'd save all of the used water that we used, and they would take it away. And I think they reclaimed the silver from the silver nitrate when they were doing that part of it.
Wow.
So that's something that it sort of came in because there was a discussion about the health hazards of some of these processes. I mean, the thing that I loved about them is you could do them in the light, or with just traditional room light, as long as you weren't in sunlight.
I see. Yeah, it's really quite interesting. So it would be something that a person could do at their home if they wanted to.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And here's another one where I have, actually I've combined Isadora Duncan, if any of you know the dancer Isadora Duncan, with a landscape. And I actually did a series of these with sort of different color palettes. This is the one that fits in with the harvest theme with the maroons and golds and sort of gray colors. But I also did another one that was like this, which was for spring. But I think the other thing about this one is it has a lot of layering to it. And it's sort of an uncertain space. The other thing I always thought, she looked very very powerful there in the space, and like she's taken over that space and is living in that space.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I like the technique. Interesting to see your different techniques.
Yeah.
So I think that's the last. Is that the last one?
I think that is, yes.
All right, so we're gonna go back through them one more time, just because
Okay.
that's fun. So then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, Helen, about what you're working on now.
Sure. Well, since we've had all this time to ourselves, I have a book that actually has calendar pages in it, and it happens to be a 2020 calendar book. And so I've been drawing in that book. I've been doing pencil drawings, and I've been doing like fine line marker drawings, quite a few landscapes and things. Because I was down in Connecticut, and because the garden, I was drawing in the garden, which was what showed it to me. And so I think that I'm thinking about how now I can use those drawings in my pieces. I think even the one with my sister and parents, that's sort of trying to begin to bring in more of my drawing into the work, sort of more the abstraction. Then the other thing I did, sort of a fun project, was I did stonework play for Diana Seskin. And I went out into that garden and I collected a bunch of stones and I just sort of threw them on the ground. And what I found was it made a story. There was one stone, I swear there was a face in it. And there was another stone that had a bird's head in it. And so as I was sort of composing this sort of this imaginary landscape, because there's part of it looks like it's above ground and part of it looks like it's below ground. But I was inspired by the shapes that I saw in the stones that I was working with. So that's another thing that I did. And then the third thing I worked on was a piece that was inspired by an Egyptian necklace at the Fitchburg Art Museum. And so again, when I did this one, it was much more spring flowers. So I went out and I took some of my jewelry because I had everything down there in Connecticut. And so I created this sort of necklace with my pearls and earrings and flowers and everything in response to that Art and Bloom call that was at the art museum. So those, I guess the thing about it is I am always doing a lot of variety of different kinds of things.
Which makes you a real artist.
And the other thing I should mention is I'm also interested in these horses that are out in North Dakota. They're called the Nakota horse, and they are descendants of Sitting Bull's horses. And so I've been out to North Dakota. I've shot a lot of footage of it, and it's now with the editor in terms of doing a documentary about the Nakota horse.
Oh, how interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's really exciting. So I wanted to ask you also in terms of the topic of harvest.
Yes.
In your travels, in your life, have you seen anything that was of interest during this time of the year?
Well, one of the other things I'm thinking it was around this time of year was they had this thing down in Brazil where they would send these lit sculptures, sort of like balloons, up into the air, and it would form a figure, and they would have all these like little tea lights, and it would be like just this magical thing that would go up into the air. I think the other thing, of course, are markets, which, you know, you think about harvest, and I live right down the street from Dick's. And so it's that idea of going and seeing whatever particular vegetable or fruit is in season, and purchasing them and eating them and stuff. So I guess it's, you know, it's that idea of the produce. And also of course, you think of pumpkins and pumpkin carving, and we did quite a bit of that with the kids. So
Yeah, it's a beautiful time of year, really beautiful around,
Mhm.
especially. So I wanted to go back to Fitchburg and your teaching, since
Yes.
we have some time, and I'm a graphic designer too, and I wanted to find out from you, like maybe some stories from your teaching days and what it was like working with the students here in Fitchburg, and over the years, how it was. Did you have
Well, I'll tell you about my miracle man. I had a student named Patrick O'Brien Dempsey, and he was a graphic design student. He was also a hockey player, and he was a hockey player that spent a lot of time in the box. It was like forward, I think. And so Patrick, he took his time. He was on the 4.5-year plan. He went out on his internship in the fall, and he went for an audition for Actors Who Can Skate. And out of 6,000 actors who can skate, he got the role of Mike Ruzioni in the movie Miracle about the 1980 hockey team. And he's now out in Hollywood pursuing a career as an actor. And he's also actually turned back and done a lot of set design and sculpture and things for movies. And so he's really, and he's also a hockey expert. Whenever they do a hockey film, I think they call in Patrick. Now, I have another student who is completely different, who spent a lot of time being an illustrator and writing books. And he's an internationally known author illustrator. His name is Peter H. Reynolds. And one of the things that we got to do is keep in close contact with the students who went out on internship. And so Peter was always, a great internship site. And so I got to go and visit him at his different studios. And, but in terms of the other thing I think is because of the department we were in, I had a lot of photography students and a lot of filmmakers in my classes. And so I think it's that idea of trying to give someone who has expertise in one area, sort of an appreciation for graphic design. And for example, the filmmakers, they had to often do DVD covers for their projects or posters and stuff. So I tried to be flexible with them so that they could learn about type and learn about composition, learn about color, but for projects that they might actually have to do in the future. But and then the other thing is, I've kept in touch with some of my students over the years, and what they remember about me in my teaching was that I was always kind, and I always tried to build them up from wherever they were to another level. Even if they were experienced, I kept trying to push them further to do better work or to do sort of more creative work. Within the thing. And the beauty of it was that I did teach students from their freshman year all the way up to their senior year. So I got to see their design skills grow. And a lot of times I was in on the interviews for their internships. And so really being able to see all of the work that they had done, or at least the top 10 to 12 pieces that they had done over their time at Fitchburg was also very rewarding. And they knew that, as they got out, if they were a good student, they could call me and say, hey, Helen, I want to change jobs, or, I'm looking for this or that. And I would try and network them in. I think Facebook actually became a very vital resource for that. Because at one time I had 1,500 Facebook friends who were, many of them were my students.
Actually, I wanted to thank you for the introduction to Angelique. She couldn't be with us tonight, but she actually, I talked to her today, and she said that was one of the nice things about being in your class was that she brought her child to school with her. And
sure.
So I did want to ask you a little bit about your teaching from the female perspective. In terms of your female students, were you able to help some of them to find jobs? Was it difficult for these young women to go to school with other responsibilities? Do you have any notes on that?
Well, I think when you have a child, that becomes, in Angelique's case, that probably was something that held her back for a little bit. But I think that if you have a supportive husband, sometimes that can sort of help to, sort of allow you to pursue your career. I think a lot of the young women did work from home for quite a while. I have a couple of former students who are teachers who teach at Mount Wachusett. And so I don't know. I think, you sort of do what you can when you have them in your classroom and try and support them the best you can. And then I suppose it's on to the next group.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
So that kind of circles me back to the group, this Central Massachusetts Women's Caucus for the Art group.
Mm-hmm.
I always get the name wrong. What had you join this organization? When did you join, and what made you interested in this organization?
Well, I think I joined fairly early on. We were just talking about having been part of it for 20 years, but I think maybe I just showed a couple of times. I wasn't on the board. But then I think I just decided that it was a very important organization. And I think the other thing that charged me up was going to a conference in New York and meeting a lot of different women from all over the country. And actually kind of on an intimate, smaller basis. I've been to a lot of conferences where you have 10,000 people, and what can you do there? But this, if you keep going to the conferences, the national conferences, you begin to make friends with the different people. And it's like old home week when you go back to a conference. So, and I think hearing about each other's work and then following their work online is also sort of a rewarding thing to do. But
so the young artists get involved if they...
Well, I always encourage them to. And I think that, again, there's a hesitancy, I think, for them because we're of a different age group, we'll just say that. But especially when we were at Rollstone Studios, I think that they were there a lot of times and they could see some of the things that they were doing. They always loved looking at the work. And there were several that actually came to a couple meetings, so.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
So Helen, what's the story with Rollstone Studios? I know you were really involved with Rollstone Studios.
Right. So what happened there was there was a woman named Ellen DiGeronimo, and Ellen was sort of the downtown coordinator for the city of Fitchburg. And so she approached my friend Ann Giancola and asked Ann if she'd like to open a studio on Main Street in Fitchburg. And so Ann called me up and said, Helen, I want to do this. Will you do it with me? And so I said, sure. And so we ended up running the studio on Main Street for 7 years. And we also had I was in charge of exhibits. And what I loved about that was you could just do what you wanted to do. You didn't have to have the schedule a year in advance. And I'll always remember there was one woman, Kirsty was her first name, but she came in and she wanted to have this show. It was all about her roots in Finland. And I said, well, sure, we got a space. We'll put it in the back there. And so sure enough, she brought in all of these very precious family items. And she talked about how her father had died over in Finland, in an area of Finland. And I was able to do that for her, and her family came to reception and all. And I think that was, it was not too long after that, she did pass away, but it was sort of this thing that she wanted to do, which was to introduce. The other thing we were involved in quite a bit in the early days was First Thursdays. And we would do all sorts of programming out of Rollstone, musicians, shows, dance performances, things like that. And what we found was if we had a lot of different things going on, that would draw in a lot of different kinds of people, and they'd all stay for the other things that were there too. So
it's really nice. I'm here. And I know there's another place I wanted to ask you about that was it called the Johnsonia? It was in the Johnsonia building. Wasn't there once a gallery?
Yes, there was. And that was a beautiful Victorian hotel apartment building that had been turned into condos. And so we worked with the fellow named Clark Strait, And we did this series where I think we did 6 different things a year, 6 different presentations. We had some people from the university come and talk. I think Kelly Morgan came and spoke about Shakespeare, and we had quilters come and rug makers come. We also would integrate a show of children's artwork from Fitchburg. And I think it was mainly the middle schools that would do that. And so that was a very popular show, because that gallery was crowded when we'd have all those kids in there and their parents and their teachers and everything. And I think the other thing was, it was a chance for the kids to actually exhibit their work in a professional space, which is something, that is always lovely. And he had fixed it all up for us. And Clark was a wonderful host. He'd always have all the snacks and the hors d'oeuvres and all of that stuff for us there. So, yeah.
I think I just missed that, but it was right before maybe I moved here. So
Yeah.
see that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just check and see if we had any questions. We have 15 more minutes.
Okay.
So we have a couple. Doreen, do we have anybody making any notes anywhere?
Hi. Yes, well, we have notes. We don't have any questions per se, but I'll start with Kat Judge to Helen. And when Helen was talking about her work with her family and the historical base, and she had posted the word beautiful. We have Angelique Loro saying, hi, Helen.
Oh, hey, Angelique. I remember when you sent me all of those baby clothes. Thank you. They were wonderful.
We have Iffy Berg saying Helen is also a historian. I think that's where the past comes in on her art.
Yes.
And then we have Doreen saying such sensitive and respectful work, and I love it.
Thank you.
That's what we've got so far.
Thank you so much, Doreen.
I love how you delve into the history of your family and you stay connected with that. You know, it seems like you reach out and you actually touch your past and your DNA past. That's how I interpret when I look at your work. It's just very sensitive and lovely, and like I said, very respectful. So very.
Yeah, I agree. I actually never understood before. I kept seeing every piece that you would do would have something to do with history, with family, with people, and I never quite got it. And so now after this, it makes a lot more sense. And I think it makes sense that you said you're kind of looking for family.
Right.
That's huge, isn't it? We're very connected to place and people. So it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for joining. I want to thank everybody else who joined us as well. I'm trying not to get emotional. Family and place is so important. It's funny. I am from the South, and so the South is a funny place. I'm going to say I'm from the white South because my history isn't, there's sadness there in the black South and happiness too. But the culture is similar, the Bible Belt, it's kind of interesting the way people lived, but the roots of the white South, depending on where you are, were English, Irish, Scottish. There's some German pockets. There's French in the Deep South and Spanish in the Deep South. But our pocket was very Irish and Protestant Irish. There were pockets of Catholic Irish, but it was primarily Protestant. And the one thing I think is interesting is that there's something with that culture, which would be Scottish too, I think. They're they are very interested in the history and the family.
Right.
And like my dad's a bookbinder in Kentucky, and they do lots and lots of family trees, genealogies that he binds for people.
Right.
So, and I remember one funeral where it was my father's second cousin. It was like extended, right? And in the South, it's not Irish style funeral, but it is similar. Everyone would sit on the porch of the funeral home and hang out, and they would talk and talk and talk. And I had a partner at one point who was from the Northeast, from New York, a New Yorican, and he didn't get it. He's like, why are we? And my dad just went and he sat on the front porch with all these old timers, and he's like, just respectful for us to be here. He's
Right.
like, it was the family. And I was like, huh, that's kind of, it's interesting how different cultures have this sense of family and history. And every culture is a little bit different. So I think, so it's interesting you say this, Helen. And now I think I get your work.
Oh, good.
I like, it's these conversations that make you understand, because there's so much thought that goes into artwork, right? Even design,
Right.
structure, design is organization, it's visual communication, but artwork is visual communication too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of thoughts that go into the back before anything comes out of the hands, right?
Yeah.
So Helen, thank you. Do you have any last comments?
Oh, no.
Any last notes?
Well, I'm pleased to see all my friends here. And I was nervous about doing this. We were talking about the fact that, oh my goodness, I'm nervous. But it was painless.
It is. I was like, you could teach all those years in front of rooms full of people. You could do it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you. So we'll be back
Okay.
next Friday, everybody. My name is Tamar. This was Helen Obermeyer Simmons. She's part of our harvest show that we had in the month of September and October. And go to gallerysitka.com. There's a tab that says Harvest. You can see Helen's work there and everyone else's work as well. And we're doing Friday nights at 6 o'clock interviews with everyone. And so we'll be back next week as well. And this will be filmed. If anyone would like a copy, I can send one and see them. I have a copy for you. I'm sorry I didn't get it to you yet, but I will. So have a great weekend, everybody, and a good night. And thank you. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Tamar.
That was fun. Bye.